Hey, and welcome back to this Flask tutorial. In this video, we're going to talk about the Flask request objects and how to get data from them. So you may remember this diagram from the first video where I was explaining the client-server model of the web and the request-response model, particularly of HTTP. And so there are these things called HTTP verbs that whenever a client is making a connection to a let's say a web server in this case, or anything that supports HTTP, the request comes as a GET request, a POST request, a PUT request, a DELETE request, and there's actually a whole list of other HTTP verbs, but these are kind of among the most common. GET is certainly the most common. So remember that the idea here is we're going to have a verb from HTTP like GET or POST. We'll just stick with those two for the second. And it's going to be connected to a resource. We want to get all the users, or we want to get a particular user. To expand that, POST usually has some data accompanied with it, or that accompanies it, maybe from a form that the user enters, or some other POST request. So if we look at this next diagram, you can see we have a GET request. A way to do that is just by going to your browser and typing in, some URL. That's going to be a GET request. A POST request, so here's a sample simple HTML form that has two fields for you to enter your first name and your last name, or the user's first name and last name, and then a button that says submit. Now, here's the HTML that generates this particular form. I don't want you to get bogged down in the HTML. This is not a tutorial series on HTML, but because we're going to use this for the time being to sort of make requests that are of other types besides GET requests, let me just kind of walk you through what this is. So the first is just the title. It's in big print because I'm using the header 2 tag. Then I have the form tags. And the things to kind of note about the form tags are the action attribute. So we're going to, I'll explain a little bit about this on the next slide, but then the method. Notice that this says post. So, and then I'm going to go to the bottom line, which is the button. So this line right here, input type equals submit, is what causes this button to show up. And whenever a submit button is pressed, the browser is going to make a request to the URL listed in action. Now, because we're only listing /form here, the action is going to go to whatever the base URL is. So, if we're still sticking with this 127.0.0.1 right now, then, it'll be 127.0.0.1:4000/form, but it's going to send the information back to the server, to that endpoint, but with a post HTTP verb, not a GET verb. So that's really important. It's going to send basically a post request with the form data. The big difference between GET and POST is where the data lives and how much data can go with it. A GET request, you could actually send this form information back to the server as a GET request, so as method equals GET, but the amount of data you can send is limited, and it's also very plainly visible in the URL. So you would see it up here if we were using a GET request for form data. So we're going to use a method post for here. So this line is just what's printing the first name, nothing crazy there. Then we have an input that's a text type, so that's what makes this little field. It's an ID. The important attribute that we're going to pay attention to for these two input areas, so this is the one for last name, is going to be the one equals name. Don't worry so much about ID right now. And the value is just the sort of default value that's there until the user changes it. Now, why is name important? Well, name is what's going to be used in the key value pairs that the browser collects the information that the user enters and sends it back to the server with. So for instance, whatever the user types in first name here, is going to go back to the server as essentially first, and then in this case John, but if the user changes it, let's say to Mark, it would be first Mark would be the value. So key would be first, value would be whatever they type in here. For last name, last would be the key, and doe would be the value. Okay, so let's look at some code that includes the forms, the get, the post, and whatnot. So to the app as it stood from the end of our last the end of the last video, I'm going to add a new route. So I'm going to add the route that is going to show the form to the user. So I'm going to say something like at app.route, and I'm going to call it, let's see, form presentation. Okay. And then I'm going to define get form, and I'm going to include the same HTML that I had on the slide, return to the client, RTURN. And to save you from having to watch me type all of that, I'm going to copy and paste it. But I explained it in the slide, so it should be pretty clear. All right. So let me just indent that a little bit. Okay, so this is the same code from the previous slide. On the slides, I put some new lines and formatted it slightly differently, but it's the same HTML. So that should be good there. So we're going to save that. Now, what we don't have is whenever this form gets displayed to the user, we don't have any code that will support what happens when they press the submit button. So let's go ahead and add one more route. So, oops, if I can type. So we'll say at app.route. Here I'm going to say form. That's going to be the endpoint. And then to indicate that this particular route is going to handle post requests, I'm going to say methods equals post. Okay. And then let me define the function. So define post form. Sorry. And then for now, I'm just going to return a string that's that just says we got some form data back. Okay. And let me just make it pretty, not actually pretty, but you know. Okay, so we've added our route for presenting the form, and then we've added a route for to handle a post request for when the form data gets sent back when the user hits submit. Okay, so let's see if this runs. Looks like it's running okay, so let me switch to the browser. All right, so I'm going to go to slash, well, you know, I already forgot what the name of it was. Form presentation, so slash form presentation. So back to the browser, form presentation, and there's the form. So maybe I'm going to type Mark F. I'm going to hit submit. And so we see our message that says got form back data via the post request, which is exactly what we put in the handler for the post request to the form endpoint. Okay, so now that we know that this is working, let's go ahead and pull the data from the post request so we can see that we're actually getting the first and last. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two variables. So first name, these are just Python variables. Now, the way I get the information from the request object from the post is I say request.form, and then I use the name attribute from the HTML form. So whatever I would have put right here. Okay, so I'm going to put first and then last name equals request.form, and say last. Okay, now you'll notice I'm getting some unhappy squigglies, so that's because I need to import the request object. Okay, so I saved it. Looks like things reloaded properly. So let's go give it a whirl again. So I'll go back to my form. I'm going to reload. So now I have John Doe. So maybe I'll put Sam Smith. And if I hit submit, well, it's still going to show me the form. So all I did was extract the data from the request variable. But what I need to do is actually echo it back to the user. So I'm going to go back to using a formatted string, and I'll say first name is first name, last name is last name. So whatever the user entered for last name. Save that again, reloaded, back to the browser. So we'll go back to the form. I'm just going to leave it John Doe. You don't need to see me type anymore. So I hit submit. So now we should see that new string pop up. And indeed we do. First name is John. Last name is Doe. So just to recap, we have added two routes. One route is a GET request that returns the HTML form that you see here. And the other is a POST request handler that handles whatever happens, that handles the data that's sent back when the user hits the submit button. And so, yeah, there you have it. Next video coming soon.